A stronger day, be your best every day. Hi, I'm Adimus, founder and director of Strengths Optimizer. I aim to help you stay healthy, be happier, and deal with challenges with greater resilience. Do you know what is system-informed positive psychology? How can we apply system-informed positive psychology in helping people and organizations to thrive? Today, you will meet Associate Professor Peggy Kern. Peggy will give you an overview of the historical development and current landscape of positive psychology. She will then unpack how we can extend the current models of positive psychology in helping people and organizations to thrive. Thank you. Hi everyone, my name is Adimus and I'm the founder and director of Strength Optimizer. Thank you for watching Strength Optimizer, the Science Up Your Wellbeing series. Today we have Peggy Kern joining us. Peggy is an associate professor at the Center of Positive Psychology at Melbourne Uni. She receives a PhD in social and personality psychology from the University of California. And she also received additional postdoctoral training at the University of Pennsylvania. How are you today, Peggy?
I'm doing pretty good. Thanks for having me on.
No worries. It's so wonderful to have you joining us, especially in sharing with us your wisdom and insights in system-informed positive psychology. But before we do that, let's spend a bit of time on getting to know you a little bit more. I noticed that, Peggy, you're not from around here. What I mean by that is that you're not from Australia. So, can you tell us where are you from and what brought you to Australia?
Yeah, so from my accent, I am not Australian, haven't quite picked that one up yet, but I've been in Australia about 6.5 years now. So I'm originally from Arizona in the US, so middle of the desert, and that's where I grew up. And I then I moved to California where I did my PhD, and then I lived in Philadelphia for 4 years while I was at the University of Pennsylvania. And then in 2014, I was on the job market and I had the opportunity for a 2-year position here in Australia at Melbourne Uni as a senior lecturer.
Yep.
And in the Center for Positive Psychology, which it was Lee Waters was directing at that time and really trying to start the center. And the MAP program was just starting, the Masters of Applied Positive Psychology. So I was offered the position, and at the time, I was looking for a job anyways. I was actually kind of on the edge of actually leaving academia. And I was like, I have the opportunity to live in Australia for a couple of years, which it seems like just sort of this adventure. And if I say no to this, I'm going to regret it. And it was only 2 years, so I wasn't deciding the rest of my life. And so I moved across the world, and 6.5 years later, I am still here and not really planning on leaving at this point. So.
What an exciting adventure, from the 2 years kind of timeline to now after 6.5 years, you're still here, and sounds like you're still enjoying, really passionate in what you do. And living in Australia as well, so wonderful. That's good. And also, I also noticed that your initial training was in social, personality, and developmental psychology, but you are actually teaching a Master of Applied Positive Psychology at Melbourne Uni. How did it happen?
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting because in many ways I feel like I sort of fell into positive psychology, but at the same time, I think I was always focused on the positive psychology perspective. So when I was a PhD student at the University of California in Riverside, I had the opportunity to work on a project that was really studying healthy aging and longevity. And so we had this amazing archival data set that followed people all the way from childhood all the way through their lives. I actually collected their death certificates to find out how long they lived and what they died from. But it was really about really understanding, well, what actually distinguishes those who actually live well and live long, healthy lives versus those who struggle a lot along the way. So this whole idea of understanding who thrives in life and why has always actually driven a lot of the work that I've done.
Yeah.
And then coming out of that, I had an opportunity for a postdoc position at the University of Pennsylvania, which often is considered sort of the home of positive psychology.
Yes.
And so I took the position. Now, at the time, my perception of positive psychology was that it's sort of this happyology of just sort of like, just make people feel happy all the time. And I think I would tend towards more the pessimistic than the optimistic side. So I was just sort of like, yeah, that pos psych is just sort of the light, fluffy stuff. But ended up with this position, and through that, I got involved in, they have a MAP program there. And so I was involved as an assistant instructor as part of the research methods subject, and worked with different students on their capstone project. And so through that, working in the field, that ended up being a 4-year position. Really, and I worked with a lot of leaders across the field. It really allowed me to really discover kind of the full breadth of what positive psychology can be, but also develop my own sort of perspective on all of that. And then coming here to Australia, it was actually, my original title was like senior lecturer in positive psychology. And I'm like, gosh, I guess I actually have to associate with positive psychology now. I think I was still on the fence, but over time, I think I've really grown into it, is just sort of, coming to a more complex perspective of what positive psychology perhaps can be, is something that I can see the real value of. And I just love that element of, one thing I love about positive psychology is it is applied. Is this not, we do want to be doing the research, but it's also how the research and the practice really feed into each other in order to actually have a real impact upon people's lives, both individually and more collectively.
So it sounds like even positive psychology, in the sense that you started taking positive psychology, your passion or research interest always be in terms of healthy aging or healthy living. It's not just in terms of longevity, or the physical health aspect, but also the whole psychological aspects, the whole flourishing and thriving aspect, even though it may not necessarily using some of the jargons or the frameworks of positive psychology.
Well, that's actually something that really fascinated me, is that my master's thesis focused on understanding healthy aging. Healthy aging is not just about the physical, and different models really think about, how engaged are you in life? What are your social connections like? What is your cognitive functioning like? What's your life satisfaction? So it's really thinking about holistically, how is a person going? Not just where are they, struggling, or where's the dysfunction, but actually thinking about where they're actually doing well. So I was coming from the health psychology perspective, is how we were studying this. And I actually find it fascinating as I came into positive psychology, how in many ways it felt like people I was talking with actually were unaware of some of the important work that is done in these other areas. And so you get these disconnects of the positive psychology perspective has really existed in some of these other areas, especially thinking about aspects of developmental psychology from a lifespan perspective and whatnot, that haven't always gotten as much credence in some of the mainstream positive psychology literature as they really should.
Yeah, and which is something that we're going to talk a little bit more and elaborate a little bit more through your expertise as well. I understand that positive psychology was founded as a sub-discipline of psychology in 1998. Since then, it experienced rapid growth in terms of its publications, research, and applications. These are the big questions to you, Peggy. Can you give us a quick overview and the landscapes of positive psychology since it started in 1998?
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic question. I always like to go back to sort of the history of fields and how they really actually came about, because it actually informs so much of our thinking and what we actually do. I like to think about positive psychology in two ways. So one is positive psychology as a discipline, which is indeed officially came about in 1998. And I also like to think about positive psychology as a perspective, which the pos psych perspective has existed long before that. And so this whole idea of some of the positive elements of the human life, thriving life, optimal development and whatnot, a lot of this was really prevalent in some of the writing of of some of the humanistic psychologists.
Yeah.
The word positive psychology was first used in a chapter by Abraham Maslow in 1954. And so work in this area existed, but it was really on the side stream. And so, in other areas, there were these elements that focused on, I was just talking about, I focused on healthy aging. That was in health psychology. So they're sort of disconnected different areas. And in psychology itself, coming out of World War II, there became a real focus on dysfunction. And so you had soldiers coming back, and this was accelerated by, for instance, the Vietnam War and others, where you have things like post-traumatic stress disorder, you have other dysfunctions. And so it became very much focused on understanding and fixing sort of human dysfunction. And that's been very important. We've learned a lot about sort of what goes wrong with humans and what to do about that. And so as post-psych was really established as a discipline, the argument was really that, we know a lot about human dysfunction, but we actually don't know enough about, what it means to actually thrive in life. And to live in those optimal ways. And so really, Martin Seligman became the incoming president of the American Psychological Association in 1998. And as part of that, he sort of founded this as a subdiscipline of psychology at that time in order to reorient the field. And it wasn't that we're letting go of all of that focus on dysfunction. That's important and that's still necessary. But it was trying to say, well, we actually need to balance that with more of a focus on, some of the positive qualities of life, of the things that make life worth living for, which moves us forward into life. And so it was established as a discipline or sort of a sub area of psychology. And there was actually quite a bit of interest. And I think part of that comes from, just historically, people were ready for a different perspective. They wanted something that were tired of all the negative news all the time. And so I think the time was just right as this came along that people were like, yes, we actually want to really focus on sort of something that's more uplifting and hopeful, as opposed to just sort of, trying to survive life. So in the early part of positive psychology, the biggest focus, I would say, is actually much more on sort of the emotional side, is sort of how you feel, that element of, happiness, feeling good in life. And so coming out of psychology, who very much had the perspective of, okay, our typical way of doing things in psychology is we might do, say, a randomized control design. So I have a treatment and control group, I'd see what works. And so to bring sort of a science to these more soft topics, if I'm going to talk about things like, emotions and relationships and love, and these are really kind of soft topics. How do you actually bring a science to it? Well, let's actually bring those same methods that we used in, medicine and other areas of psychology. Could we actually apply that? And so you had what were called positive psychology interventions. And it was, trying things out and saying, can we actually make people feel better by doing an activity such as a gratitude intervention or an act of kindness? And so it was adding the science to, understanding some of these more positive oriented topics over time. And so through this, you started to see a real interest in sort of this alternative way of thinking. There was a huge growth in terms of research across various areas. I think some of that was a growth in research, but I think some of it was actually just all of this became an umbrella that brought together kind of some diverse areas into this whole kind of connected area. So as opposed to being disconnected from each other. You also had a growing number of practitioners. And so at the University of Pennsylvania, they established the first Masters of Applied Positive Psychology, which created a whole kind of group of people that learned about the science and then learned how to apply it. And that has developed over time. And So in the early stage, you kind of had a lot of activity in both research and practice. And I would say a lot of that was around kind of reorienting psychology to really focus on sort of the positive. And so that accelerated the field. That perspective then kind of spread across other areas as well. And so you started to have the same perspective applied to things like health. And so you could have positive health, neuroscience, so positive neuroscience, education, positive education.
Wow.
When I came to the University of Pennsylvania, I kind of was and got introduced to MAP. I just kind of felt like, okay, just add positive to the front of anything, and then all of a sudden you can have an area. But it was that idea of people were drawn to that perspective and saying, well, how does it apply in these different areas, and kind of trying to wrestle in that space. Now, as that has developed over time, there's also been a lot of backlash against that. And I think there was a backlash across several things. Number one is that huge focus on the positive at sort of the expense of the negative. So in the early days, and I think it becomes important if you're starting a discipline, you kind of have to take an extreme view that just sort of disrupts thinking. And so I think in many ways it just sort of had to be like, throw out the negative, focus on the positive. But then it was sort of like, well, but there's value in the negative. And some of the greatest growth sometimes we see occurs through struggle. And so you started having others talking about, for instance, Todd Kashdan talked about the upside of the dark side. And so thinking about the value that can play. Work by others focused on the idea of post-traumatic growth. So what's the growth that can actually occur through some of the traumatic experiences that people actually have? And so it started to identify, the negative actually has value and it's not excluding it. And so the field has moved more towards sort of thinking about sort of the whole of human experience, both the positive and negative, but how can we move that more towards the positive, what is good, what is more about our strengths as opposed to deficits. So there has sort of been a rebalancing of things. The other thing that we've seen is a move towards, and we're seeing this more recently, is towards, well, I guess two ways that I've seen a broadening is, number one, in terms of the early days really focused a lot on sort of the emotional side of well-being. And even a lot of the interventions and whatnot was about sort of changing sort of how many positive emotions you feel versus how many negative emotions you feel, or your sense of life satisfaction. What we've seen is sort of a move away from emotions, or sort of the hedonic side of well-being, and a move towards what's been called the eudaimonic side of well-being. So things like the meaningful life, positive relationships with others, a sense of mastery over my environment. And so this move towards what Aristotle wrote about in terms of the good or virtuous life. What is that? How can we actually develop that more in people? Which, interestingly enough, actually aligns a lot with sort of the stuff I studied around healthy aging back as a PhD student. The other thing that I've seen more recently, and this is where a lot of my work comes in, is a move towards complexity. And so really thinking about, the positive stuff is great and it's nice to think about, but what happens in the messiness of the real world? It's nice to think about if I study this intervention with university students, that gives some evidence for it, but I try to do it in a workplace, and I'm like, okay, now you're going to take this 40-minute survey, and then you're going to write every day. And I'm just laughed out of the office. Or I try to apply some of this in a school, and you're not going to get the students to pay attention to it whatsoever. And so we actually have to start to think about the complexity of actually thinking about how we actually apply some of these ideas in the real world, with all of the challenges, with all of the struggles, with people's different perspectives coming from different cultures and different contexts, and how this actually comes together. And so I think that's where I see the field moving now, is towards wrestling with this complexity more, thinking about the challenges that actually exist in our real world, and the contributions that pause psych can and cannot give. Thinking about the methods that we use. We started with sort of these simple designs. Well, that doesn't quite work when we get into sort of the real world and some of the challenges that are there. So we have to even be thinking, what is the right approach to what we call science or evidence?
Yeah.
And I think we still need to ask some of those questions on things.
Yeah. Peggy, it's always so fascinating and to see and hear your passion when you explain in terms of the whole historical movement and development in positive psychology. Even though this is not the first time I'm hearing about this, but again, there's always so much I can learn from you just hearing in terms of the different waves of positive psychology. And I guess that's what has been coined in some of the scholastic literature, talking about the first wave of positive psychology, which is a lot of emphasis, as you mentioned earlier, on the positive emotions or the positive traits, and almost as exclusive of the negative aspects of human experience. But then the second wave of positive psychology, because they acknowledge that there is always a place, for the both positive and negative, and how they actually interplay and interconnected to, I guess, to demonstrate a fuller extent of human experience to now, which is perhaps, you may use the word third wave, they're seeing positive psychology moving from a young field to now to a more of a mature scientific field, where there's a lot more complexities and contextualized in the real world applications. So that's actually a perfect segue for the next questions. And it's also a lot of your work's been done in this area, which is called system-informed positive psychology. So in a nutshell, what is system-informed positive psychology, and how does it differ from the traditional positive psychology that you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, so systems-informed positive psychology, or SIPP, as we've been calling it, really is an area that, and this has really been one of my core foci over really the past 3 or 4 years at this point. So it's been a real development over time. And what we're really talking about is systems or positive psychology. So system sciences is a very interdisciplinary, very broad area of focusing on systems. So a system is any sort of interconnected kind of group that they create their own way of existing, essentially, and they impact. You have different elements that all impact and interact with one another. So different systems we might think of is, the human body is a system. And so different parts of our body all work together to make us function in everyday life. A family is a system. We think about, if you come home and you're in a particular mood and you react perhaps in a way to your partner or your child, and they've had a different day and they reacted a different way than you'd expect, and then all of a sudden we end up with an argument in something that should never have been a big deal at all. Now, why is that? It's because we have different people in our system coming together from their own perspectives, interacting with each other in a dynamic way. Other systems, a school is a system. Yeah. But schools are also part of school systems. And at a very large level, you have like the solar system is a very large system. So systems could be anything from very small to very large. But each element is sort of interconnected to create their own way of functioning, essentially. And we are a part of a lot of different systems, which all are interacting with each other as well. So the system sciences are about understanding, impacting upon, making sense of systems. And so it's existed for decades and impacts all sorts of different disciplines and whatnot. And so what we're doing in SIPP is we're really saying is that is drawing on systems, theories, practices, tools, and whatnot, actually applying them to our way of thinking about positive psychology to actually address the idea of complexity, and to actually say, how can we bring these two areas together to really move towards optimal systems? So how can we really bring out optimal functioning in both individuals and the systems that they're actually a part of? So it's not just the individual, it's actually thinking about the individual as part of an interconnected system. So how does that differ from traditional positive psychology? First of all, positive psychology has primarily focused on individuals. There are parts that focus on, for instance, organizations, or, there's some that do kind of more broader levels and whatnot. But much of the work in positive psychology, and even think about the history we just talked about, it came out of psychology, clinical psychology, which is about the individual. Yeah. And so there was a bias that came into that towards thinking about how can we actually impact upon a person's well-being or a person's happiness. And so we might do some interventions to focus on that. Now, that might be good if, I can give you an intervention to make you feel all good and whatnot. But imagine I give you an intervention, improves your well-being. So for instance, there's an intervention called job crafting. So you can find benefit if you're not happy with your job in crafting your job, perhaps by changing how you relate to other people, or perhaps the tasks that you want to do, so that your job will be more enjoyable. So I want to focus on your well-being. So we identify in your job that a lot of your time is sucked up with doing things that you don't like doing. So I could actually craft my job to give those tasks to somebody else that perhaps has less power than I do. So, because I have status, and so you could do the emails or whatever I don't want to do, so that I have more time doing what I want to do. Yeah. Now, from that perspective, my well-being is doing really well right now, except for the fact all of the people that I've given my work to are actually miserable now.
Delegation and everything.
Exactly. And so by focusing on the individual, we've actually created ill-being for others. So a systems perspective actually says we actually can't just focus on the individual. We actually have to think about the individual as part of a collected whole. Yeah. I like to think about it as like a garden. A garden, if I focus on an individual flower, I could get a great flower and make it grow strong. But if it's sucking all the nutrients out of everything else, that's not a flourishing garden. That's a flourishing flower. Yeah. And traditional positive psychology has really focused a lot on the individual, and actually at times at the expense of the garden. And so we actually need to be thinking about it more as the collective. Beyond the individual, a lot of it is actually really focused on sort of the sense of agency. What can I do as an individual to impact, my well-being and whatnot, which in many cases is important because, we actually have to actively take care of our mental health and well-being. Just like if I want to be physically fit, I actually have to, stay active, eat well, sleep well, etc. In the same way, I actually need to actively take care of my own well-being. And that's, comes out of the traditional pos psych perspective. But that's actually not possible for everyone. If someone is in a very toxic workplace, or if they're being, abused at home or whatever, or, actually, it doesn't actually matter what they do, is they're actually going, they're not going to be well. And so in that case, what we could be like, you should just do this positive psychology intervention, you'll feel better. And yet there's so much other stuff that's coming on that is actually crushing them. So now all of a sudden it's their fault that they're not feeling well, even though actually everything around them has actually made it actually impossible for them to experience well-being. And so in that sense, we actually need to be removing the things that are actually toxic to that person. And that if we just put it on the person, then we've actually blamed the very person that, and oftentimes we might see this in terms of those without power in a system are those who often actually well-being is not accessible to them, even though it really actually should be. And so human agency is important in terms of taking responsibility for our own well-being when we can, but we also need to be thinking about, am I making well-being possible for others? Or am I actually blocking that through the things that I'm actually doing? The other way that it differs from traditional pos psych is really embracing this idea of complexity. It's really saying that, traditional pos psych is really actually about, making things as simple as possible. Is do this activity, it'll make you feel better. SIPP really says, the world is complex. And if we actually just go for simplicity, we can actually, number one, not only not be effective, but we could actually create harm in many different ways. I actually think, the COVID-19 pandemic is actually an amazing kind of perspective about this.
Yeah.
Here in Australia, we went into, especially in Melbourne, we went into very extensive, one of the most restrictive lockdowns around the world. And there was a lot of systems thinking that went into that. So they actually had supercomputers that were actually going through all the sorts of different scenarios. How is this actually going to impact our economy if we make this decision? How is that then going to flow down? What are going to be the mental health impacts? And actually trying to weigh the consequences out. And so in that sense, we can actually weigh those together and say, you know what, short-term kind of inconvenience to people is actually going to be better in the long term because I've actually mapped that all out.
Yeah.
In some other places, it's actually about, well, what feels right to me right now? I don't want to be restricted because that's a very simple, I'm looking at the singular from my perspective, what is right, what is wrong. And from that, we can actually make some poor decisions that can actually have some big consequences, not just for us, but for others that oftentimes we don't realize that broader impact of things.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, I guess that when it comes to system-informed positive psychology, as you mentioned earlier, it is a complex system that involves many individuals as well as the external system as well. So definitely, today's discussion will go beyond more the in-depth type of detailed discussions. But what I like is when you use the analogy of the flourishing flower versus the flourishing gardens. I think that really paints a very pertinent picture in terms of, yes, as much as we are talking about looking after our individual well-being, but sometimes at what expense? Because at the end of the day, and as I said, that we're all connected as human race, you see, and sometimes that I guess, especially this may not sound politically correct, but I'm just going to say it, especially sometimes in a very individualized society where there's so much assertion in terms of my rights, my entitlement, my eligibility, but then without realizing they are, as I say, there's so many systems that perhaps we may be adverse of impacting or harming with or without our realization. So this whole system-informed positive psychology, once again, not only at the different levels of complexity, but also relevance to understand that we are living in the real world, that this whole reductionist type of approach, yes, sometimes it may work for some individual, but yet at the same time, now it's time to see beyond the individual focus and look at the collective well-being.
One of the core things that we say in SIPP is this idea of what we've called interbeing. So this comes from a person, Han, who talks about it's not just we are, but we are because of others. It's like we can't actually exist without our interconnection with other people. And I think 2020 has certainly shown how incredibly interconnected we are with other humans, and that I can do an action, but my actions actually have an impact on others that I'm connected with, whether or not I actually realize it. And, and so we actually need to be thinking not just about me as a person, but me as part of how do I impact on those around me?
Yeah.
How do I impact on the environment? If I do something in a workplace, and I might be, my decisions for my employees, what effect is that going to have on them when they then go home to their families? And so then they're interacting with their family and their children. And so, for instance, if I'm overworking my employees and they go home very stressed, then all of a sudden they might they might not make the home as a pleasant environment. And then the young people don't feel loved and connected. They then go to school, they act out at school. And so now in our classroom, they're not learning well, they're disrupting the other students and whatnot. We start to see the ripple effects of everything that we actually do because we are so interconnected as human beings.
Yeah, beautifully said. So in terms of this system-informed positive psychology perspective of the framework, what are some of the implications when it comes to research and practice then, Peggy?
Yeah, so I think from the research side, one thing is several different things is number one, it does challenge some of our ways of doing our research, even how we do our research in terms of some of the traditional approaches that we might use in terms of what we consider scientific and not scientific, actually needs to change when we actually start to think about some of this complexity. I might give you an intervention that has worked in the laboratory, using a control and treatment group and whatnot, but what does that look like in your everyday life? And is it going to have the same effect on things? We actually need to be thinking about even how we study what is actually evidence and what is not evidence, in a way that actually kind of embraces sort of the messiness of the real world. I think it moves much more towards much more action research. So often we have sort of practice goes on and research goes on, and they're not really actually interconnected enough with each other. And so you have researchers researching things, but it actually doesn't actually work in the real world. And the practitioners are doing things that are not actually informed by the research at all because they've moved so far from it. What it actually says is we actually need to marry those together more and actually have much more of them immediately feeding into one another. And that's something that we've been doing in our work is very much sort of, I have a team that's like partly practitioners, partly researchers, and we're all working together and we're constantly learning from each other through all of that. I think it impacts upon some of the methods that we use as well. From a practice perspective, one thing, a kind of a direct thing coming out of that is just because there's a study that's been done on something doesn't mean it's going to work for you. Having scientific evidence, well, how does it fit with the particular context? What is the background and perspective of the people that I'm working with? Will that actually be relevant or will it not be relevant? We also need to be thinking about, who is actually included. So we can be thinking about different people in our system. And oftentimes we actually only listen to certain voices. And oftentimes it's the people who actually have more power or more status in a system. And so I might come up with a perfect solution in terms of what a community is needed. And then I go and roll it out to them and it doesn't work at all because it doesn't actually meet the needs that people actually have. And so it means I actually need to be listening to different voices in the system and really actually hearing, not just telling them what they need, but what do they really need? And not actually just making those assumptions of what is actually right on things. Another practical thing is I like to think about it, and this becomes very important for thinking about complexity. We've talked about it in terms of this word simplexity. So simplexity, I love it. It's this beautiful bringing together of simple and complex. Because the reality is people don't like complexity. As soon as I start to say, you know what, this is how we're going to fix things, and it's very complex, you're like, no, I don't want that. Give me the program that's going to have this effect. And so what we need to do as whether we're a researcher, whether a practitioner, is we need to look at, okay, what is the big picture? We need to map out the complexity. There's some really great systems tools that can let us actually map out the complexity of the system. And then we can start, okay, based on this broader knowledge, what are those simple places we can intervene? And so that then we can actually sort of zoom in, intervene in that place. And then we need to zoom back out and say, okay, how does this fit? What impact did it have? Did it have the right effect or did it not? And now from there, now where do I need to focus? So sort of this, look at the big picture and then zoom in to actually look at the small, what is the right step right now to actually have an impact and what impact is that actually going to have? And then I need to zoom out and think about that broader picture. Another implication is really thinking about the role of responsibility. I think a systems-informed perspective really challenges us to think about what is our responsibility and challenge others to say, what is their responsibility? One thing I see a lot is, people escaping responsibility. Oh, it's management's fault, or it's parents' fault, or it's the government's fault, or whatever. And so we actually need to be thinking about what is within my control. Am I actually doing the things to support my well-being and support the well-being of others around me? and what are the things that are actually the responsibility of, whether it's government, whether it's institutions in society, whether it's, you know, employers, whoever it is, to actually be creating conditions for well-being to actually happen. You know, if I want to have a thriving garden, I actually have to create, you know, tend the soil and give the water and things like that, so that the conditions are there for well-being to actually happen.
Yeah.
So this kind of, you know, challenging people to take responsibility for what is in their responsibility, but not taking responsibility for the things that actually, you know, actually really should be done by others.
Yeah. And once again, you're giving us another beautiful analogy in terms of zooming in and zooming out. You know, sounds like system-informed positive psychology is a very agile approach that takes into the complexity of human experience and conditions into considerations, but yet at the same time to see that how changing one simple thing can actually have an impact or ripple effects on the larger system. And when it comes to, I guess, that putting in a more practical level, so can you give us 1 or 2 examples of how we can actually use system-informed positive psychology to help people or organizations to thrive?
It's a great question, and something that our group is still working with, of sort of like, well, what does this practically really look like in ways to actually use this well? I think a way that I've seen it is in some of the schools that I've worked with that really have been on a journey for maybe 5 to 10 years to really become sort of a real, they really want to become a thriving school. Yeah. And within that, there's no quick fix. It's not that we bring in this program to build well-being. You know, we'll do this we'll have a positive education class each week for a term, and then, you know, then we'll have well-being in our school. Actually, it's been sort of this understanding that whole picture. And so we might actually start with saying, okay, actually, let's bring together different people in our community. We can use something called appreciative inquiry, which brings different people together and actually does an inquiry into understanding, what is it we actually really like about our school? What would our school look like if it actually was the best it could actually be for us? Yeah. And we might do a discovery together, and that actually gives us a vision of what is the school that we actually want to be creating together. And so it's bringing people together as a community to actually say, what is the school we actually want to be working towards? And then we can start to say, okay, so now we have our vision of where we're going. And so now what is needed? Well, maybe we actually need to actually see, where is our school right now? And so we might actually, you know, do some auditing, do a survey, and actually identify, well, where are we now compared to where we want to be? What are the strengths that we have? What are people already doing? I don't want to be doing, you know, activities if you're already doing that. How can we actually really learn from what's already being done and then bring more of that out, or perhaps shift things a bit to actually improve what we actually do? And so we might actually say, well, where are we? And then we might say, you know, okay, actually, our way of leading things is not necessarily right. You know, maybe we don't have the right culture. Maybe we actually need to change some of the language that we use, or how we actually reward people. You know, if we reward them for the number of students that actually get, you know, the highest ATAR score or whatever, you know, what does that make about our culture? It means our culture is all about achievement. And that me as a teacher, you know, my value is based on how well my students do. You know, maybe we actually need to change our focus to actually say, you know what, we actually want to be bringing out the best in each student. That might not be highest achievement. That might be excelling in, you know, being a really good friend to others, or, you know, being a really good leader, or other different strengths that different young people might have. So we might actually change some of our ways of actually holding people accountable. And so, you know, we might focus on different areas. You know, our staff training, how do we train them? What skills do they have? What skills do they not have? How involved are our parents in our community? And so we might, again, we're zooming in and zooming out, shifting and being agile over time, because our communities are always changing. And then over time, we have seen schools that really have changed the culture in ways that really are, you know, they're places that young people want to be. They're learning, that it's bringing out the best in them, and really becoming the leaders that we want them to be.
Yeah. Wow. So again, when I talk about the system-informed positive psychology, I guess that in a nutshell is that once again, yes, it's complex, but yet at the same time, it's also interconnected between the individuals as well as wider systems as well. Sometimes, as you say, especially in larger systems such as school, it takes ongoing, intentional, deliberate efforts, collaborations, revision, changing things around to actually see the whole well-being, so to speak, happening at the individual level as well as at the school and the system level as well. I guess I just want to ask you the last question, which is a little bit more lighthearted in the sense that what's one thing that you have been doing this week to look after your own well-being, Peggy?
So a couple things that work really well for me is, number one, staying active. So running and cycling and just going for a walk really just lift me up. So there is that interconnection of the physical and the mental that just gives me a boost. And spending time in nature. So just going for a walk down by the creek, or just even on some of the walks near me, just through the park or whatever. Just nature is so powerful, but it could just be simple things of just noticing, the flowers that are there, or the smells. And so being contemplative, even as you go about things, and just, being grateful for the little things that we have. And I think that's one thing that the challenges of this year have really brought to me, is just really, really being grateful for what I do have.
Yeah.
And really, savoring that.
Awesome. And I'm just looking at your profile picture right now. Looks like behind you has this awesome, beautiful, what do you call it, scenery. Do you remember where was the place?
Yeah, so that's Cape Willamari down on Phillips Island. So love it down there.
Beautiful. Well, that's all the time that we have for today. Once again, thank you so much for joining us, Peggy. And obviously, if you're interested in finding out more about Peggy's research and application in system-informed positive psychology, make sure you visit her website at peggykern.org. Once again, that's Peggy Kern, KERN.org. Thank you for watching. I'm Adimus from Strength Optimizer, and we're here to bring out the best in you through optimizing your strengths. Have a fantastic day, everyone, and thank you so much once again for joining us, Peggy. Wishing you a Merry Christmas and Happy New Year.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.